Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to our meeting this evening, and this particular welcome if you haven't been along to our society before. This evening's session is going to be different from usual because our speaker is in where is it? Ballyferriter. Sorry, I forgot. She's in Ballyferriter. But so we're doing it through a video link. And so our particular thanks are due to William Casey, because I wouldn't have a clue how to sort this out. But William has very kindly stepped into the bench to make it possible. Now we'll get going in a moment, and I'll leave notices. I've got one or two at the end. Well, our speaker, as you know, this evening is Dr. Connie Kelleher, and we're very privileged to have her. She is secretary on the International Committee on Underwater Cultural Heritage, and that committee exists to promote protection, research, and responsible management of underwater cultural heritage, which is a brief that they fulfill worldwide. She's also senior archaeologist with the National Monument Service and heads up the Underwater Archaeology Unit. She is senior advisor for the World Heritage Site Skellig Michael, and she is on the board of the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology. And there is more I could add, but I think that makes it very clear that we're very privileged to have her as our speaker. So Connie, it's over to you and to William, and you're very welcome via this link.
Well, thank you very much, and I would like to thank the Society for inviting me. It's always a pleasure and an honor to give a talk, and I want to particularly thank you for accommodating me not having to travel in this gloomy, stormy day all the way from West Kerry. So I very much appreciate that. And I suppose I apologize for not being there in person, but the gods were against me for various reasons. So I'm very grateful for you arranging this remotely. So some of you may be familiar with my work in the sense of having heard me talk before on pirates. So some of what I'm going to say is going to be familiar to you, but hopefully it won't be too familiar, and it will just remind you or rejig your memory on the amazing world of pirates that was there in the 17th century all along the West Cork coast. So I'll kick off. I suppose when we think about the West Cork coast, you're very much embedded in it down there. I love the West Cork area. I've been kind of visiting it since the early 90s when I first stuck out my thumb and hitched down to Baltimore. And then I did my master's on Baltimore and the O'Driscolls, and that I did, kind of stuck in my head that there was more to what was going on in the landscape there, and one thing led to another, and the whole story of the pirates came up. But I love West Cork. I love the people down there, particularly because they have been so helpful to me in my studies and in my visits down there. And I couldn't have done my studies without all of ye and everyone I met down there giving me information on the landscape that is part of what ye are, and you're part of it. So ye made sense of an awful lot of the landscape that I've written about. So due credit to everyone down there. The particular area I was looking at was really generally from Kinsale back to Bantry, the widest part of it. But really around, I suppose, the Baltimore to Crookhaven area in particular, which was the kind of hub of the pirate activity at the time. But the whole landscape is conducive all along from Kinsale back to Bantry to clandestine activity, smuggling, piracy, and the like. Because of its rugged landscape, its geology, the topography of the land, allowing for secretive operations in the dead of night, small coves and harbours. And at the time in the 17th century, a willing local populace that was willing to assist the pirates as well. This is kind of what we're looking at, and I'm very much about looking outward and looking inward, both from the land out to the sea and from the sea into the land, to really get that dual perspective on what the landscape means and the seascape means to a coastal environment and what it allows you to do. So this is just a view across Roaring Water Bay, Long Island, Skull and Crook Harbour, all the way along towards Lemcon there on the very right. So it's a beautiful landscape, as I say, and every little cove has a story to tell. This is just a zoom in, I suppose, of the previous maps to show you the particular areas, particularly around Baltimore, which is the key hub, along with Lemcon and to the west of the Pirate Alliance. But all along, when piracy, and I'll get into it later, when in the, I suppose, the first quarter of the 17th century, from 1620s onwards, piracy changed slightly, and we see piracy being dominated by the Ottoman Turks, but still with some of the pirates who were active in the earlier period, part of those fleets. And I'll talk about a wreck in your neighbourhood there in Dunmorley Bay in a little while. So there's stories, as I say, to be told all along that coastline to do with pirates and smuggling. But this was a coastal landscape that was fortified from the very early period. Very, very early period. Is somebody waiting to get in there? Just notice. Do I have to admit them? Apologies.
No, you're fine.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, so because I was looking at the particular area, and I suppose carrying on from my studies of the O'Driscolls, I'll just push that over there. I looked at the kind of Gaelic landscape and how the evolution of the landscape through time. And as we know, the Gaelic lordships, some of them had their own fleets. So they were maritime lords, and they were accused of piracy and privateering and illicit activity, particularly the O'Driscolls from Baltimore. And I just, again, looked at some of their castles. They had about 25 castles overall, but both inland and on the coast. And then they were slowly pushed down to the very West Cork area eventually, with the advent of the Normans, and then the plantations coming down and pushing the Gaelic lords westward. But you can see that the castles there, just belonging to one Gaelic lordship, very much focused on the sea and commanding the harbours and the coastal areas along that. And we see that all along from Bantry with the O'Sullivan Beara, all along even the O'Donovan Castle in Castlehaven, and all along to the O'Learys in the area there from Rosscarbery and that part of the coast. So the Ilere, of course, their crest has their ship on the crest as well. So, and my mother was an O'Leary, so I have a good understanding of the background to the O'Leary clan, and the ships were very important to them as well. So we have maritime lordships commanding the coast, and piracy wasn't just an event in the 17th century. It was there throughout the period. It was a way of life for coastal people. But I suppose the particular piracy I was looking at was a specific time during the plantation period of a particular type of piracy. Gaelic lords were very much part of the, I suppose, piratical scene in the early Gaelic days as well. So in a way, the pirates of the early 17th century inherited a landscape that was, why isn't my slide moving? Sorry. So again, I put this one in here, Kilcoe, because it's so dominant in the landscape because of the colour. But these castles were dominant in the landscape, and that was the whole point of them in one way. When you were coming from the sea, you saw these fortifications in the landscape and you knew this was a protected landscape. So even in that earlier time in the Gaelic lordships, before the fall of the Gaelic lordships following the Battle of Kinsale, this was a dominant feature within the landscape. So this is the kind of landscape that the pirates came to build their business around as well. We have an archipelago down there as well, which is Roaring Water Bay, with its extensive group of islands. And I'm very interested in the whole idea of using islands as staging points, and as looking in from the sea. So when you look in, you see these from a distance, the islands become part of the land. But when you're closer, you can see that the islands form staging posts, choke points, as we call them, where smaller fleets of boats that the pirates would have commanded can easily navigate through these island points, but the larger king's ships, as they were known at the time, or what became the Royal Navy, were too big to go into around the island. So the landscape itself and the seascape itself and archipelagos were very conducive to this kind of activity. And if you look at the Pirates of the Caribbean in this early 18th century, they chose areas with islands and with archipelagos because it allowed them to capture ships as staging points, but then as choke points to corral ships, and then also to make their escape through little inlets and places, out of the way places in their smaller ships. So very much utilizing the landscape for the activity that was best for them. So you can see here, this is just one part of West Cork that permitted that kind of activity. But it's all along West Cork, and I just took the screenshot of the Ordnance Survey map from our Historic Environment Viewer in the National Monument Service. And you can see, of course, all the red dots all along the coast, very much focused on the coastline. But you see all the islands as well. Here's Rosscarbery in the middle of it, Skull, and all the way down around the coast. So again, islands feature strongly in this, and the fortification of the landscape, whether it's from the promontory forts right up to the castles themselves. I'm interested in the natural heritage in so much as we have, again, references in the early periods of the Gaelic lordships and their maritime activities, or capabilities rather, to make, I suppose, extorting and exploiting other nations like the Spanish and the French when they came to fish, and they would tax them and exert dues from them, even for bringing their fish catch ashore. So very much part, again, of utilizing the area and the resources of the area to make their living and make their money out of. This is again Roaring Water Bay. It's now a protected area with 10 species, including seabirds and 5 habitat species. So it's still a very important area from a natural heritage perspective. But again, the ruling lords identified this just all along the coastline here, the importance of the fisheries at that time. So from a scape perspective, whether it's a landscape, seascape, or indeed islandscape, it all points to maritime activity and maritime interconnections. So it's, again, as I say, looking to seaward from the land, looking landward from the sea, and then in between the islands sit, so you can do both from the island. So it's thinking of the landscape and what it did for those living in the area who had maritime capabilities way back when in the early days, and looking for the evidence of that activity then within that landscape. And particularly, of course, illicit activity within the remote landscape. And I think remote as well is the key to that, because here's the map from the Dartmouth collection, the province of Munster. It's in the Greenwich Maritime Museum, which very much a part of the Munster plantation maps at the time, and very much showing the coastal areas, the ships, and the maritime perspective of view of the Munster area during the plantations. And I just zoomed in there, and again, all the main areas are shown within the maps from Crookhaven here, all the way along to Corkhaven here. And again, you see in here there's Carberry and all of those. So very much important areas, harbours and the likes, and they were all listed as well as part of that. But sometimes you get lucky, and this is the Dutch map that's now in Germany, in the archives in Germany, in Göttingen. It's from a Leishart, which is a kind of a sailing directions. So it's a book, essentially, with 4 maps. This is the one for the southwest of Ireland, and this is the main one in one way, because it was specifically drafted to identify the pirate harbours in West Cork. It shows from Castlehaven back to Crookhaven, which is one of the other reasons I chose to look at that, because it's very specific about that, and very specific, pardon me, it's very specific about showing Crookhaven, and because they even have the depth ranges shown there as well. So this is really, I feel like an X marks the spot, because it shows exactly where the pirates were. But it's an anti-pirate map in many ways, rather than being a pirate map, because it was drafted specifically to rid the area of pirates, so that the Dutch could go in and well, they were supposed to capture the pirates. They got a commission from James I to do so, but they weren't completely. That was in 1612 that this was drafted, and in 1614 the Dutch. You see their ships depicted here, Dutch yachts. They went in supposedly under commission to capture the pirates here in Crookhaven, under Patrick Maya, and they went way beyond it. They attacked the pirate fleet, and they also attacked the townspeople. So there was about 30 people killed and massacred there. So they went way beyond their remit, and they didn't capture the pirates, they killed them. So a really important map, because it shows, and from an archaeological perspective, because it shows features in the landscape that are now gone. So the O'Driscoll Tower House attached to what's the extended fortified house here in Baltimore. The Tower House is now gone. The Tower House that fell in 1925 rather, in Castlehaven. And we know there was burial ground up here on the headland in Marine Point. I think Boyle Somerville did some excavations there in the 1800s and found burials and human remains. But here it depicts a chapel, so it explains why there's a burial ground there, because the chapel is obviously now gone. So it's a very important map from an archaeological perspective to show different aspects of the landscape and the archaeology within that landscape. It isn't accurate, obviously. But it seems to have been drawn from the sea rather than having been drawn from the land, where certain features looked to be islands, and they're not. They're part of the land. So Ahadown here obviously is part of the land, but it's drawn as 2 islands. So there is inaccuracies there, but it goes right up to Abbey Strawberry here in Skibbereen, and you can see here there's quite a settlement there in Skibbereen. So on various levels to this type of study, or any maritime study, maps are a key source to understand the landscape and what was going on there in the earliest period, if you're lucky enough to have maps to draw on. But why was there an explosion in piracy at the time? Well, the period I suppose I'm talking about is 1603 to the 1630s. We have a huge change politically. Queen Elizabeth I died, and then she was known kind of generally as a warring queen. She invested in her navy and her privateers like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, and she was there during the time of the Spanish Armada, the Counter Armada, the Battle of Kinsale. So very much a time of conflict and maritime engagement. James preferred to consider himself as a king of peace. He came in 1603 when Elizabeth died. He joined the crowns. He was James VI of Scotland, so he was able to join the three crowns of Scotland, England, and Wales. And in 1604, he, under the Treaty of London, he made peace with Spain, negotiated peace with Spain. So that was a huge kind of a maritime conflict, historical conflict between the Iberian Peninsula and the English Empire at the time, now under peace. So there was that change. There was also the change, of course, from the Tudors under Elizabeth to the Stuarts under James. There was the end of the 9 Years' War in the Battle of Kinsale, and as I said earlier, this sparked the kind of end and the fall of the Gaelic order. And we also had the completion of the Munster plantation that started in the 1570s and 1580s and continued on and was completed then more or less under James. And of course, then you had the Ulster plantation as well from about 1610 onwards. And it went from a landscape of privateers under Elizabeth, where basically private individuals who had ships could be contracted under a commission or a letter of marque from a government, in this case England under Elizabeth, and they could legitimately attack the enemies of the crown. So that would have been Spain and Portugal and those at the time. So privateering was a legitimate way to, I suppose, carry out piracy. But James looked at privateering as the same as piracy, and he outlawed privateering. So you had thousands of men who were privateers and legitimate seafarers now out of work, and they had no recourse but to turn to piracy. You also, on a wider level, had the expansion of empire through the maritime exploration and colonization, more exploration under Elizabeth, but then colonization under James. And you see the setting up of places like Jamestown and Yorktown in Virginia in America, and really even the Irish in the Amazon. So you had all these explorations taking place and colonizations elsewhere. And there was the beginning of the vying for maritime empires, where you had the English Empire, the Dutch Empire, Scandinavian empires, and French empires, all vying for control of the New World produce, the West Indies, the East Indies produce, and the produce from the New World, and that included slaves from Africa. So the slave trade. So you had all this going on, and at the time, and it permitted the advent of a period of piracy within the North Atlantic that wasn't seen before on that level and wasn't seen thereafter either. So I term it the Alliance of Pirates because it was very much a hierarchy of men who came together, many of whom were those legitimate privateers and seamen or sailors who were now out of work and didn't have any other recourse but to turn to piracy. Others, of course, who were pirates and joined the ranks of the pirates under the Alliance. They really kind of adopted I can only term an unwritten code because we have no evidence for a code, but their actions and behavior suggest that they had some form of code, whether it was written or it was oral, we don't know. But they elected Richard Bishop, these were all Englishmen, as Admiral, Peter Easton who as their Vice Admiral, and Thomas Frank as their Rear Admiral. And all of these at one stage or another were living in West Cork. And of the three of them, Peter Easton is the only one who didn't settle in West Cork in the end. He went off and lived in the Mediterranean. But the other two did, and they drop out of our records after about 1615 or 1620. There were up to overall, in the overall pirate fleet, there was about 72 pirate captains, and each captain would have had about 3 ships. So you begin to get an idea of the numbers of men that we were dealing with and the number of ships too. Many settled their families, so it's very much an amphibious activity rather than just being on the high seas, opportunistic piracy. This is very much rooted in the land as well as on the sea. And by having their families living locally, it became very much a business because they had to care for their families and send money home and spend time at home as well in West Cork. And that's where the remoteness of the landscape assisted their activities. You won't be able to read this, but this is just some of the list of pirates that I've been able to, all 71, 72 of them, I think, and then the associated ships with some of those pirates. So again, it just gives you an idea of the numbers. So each one of those captains would have had their own 1 or 2 or 3 ships. And then when they needed to, they all came together as an alliance. So you can see the strength in numbers. And how it was very hard to defeat such a number of men going across the Atlantic, operating out of West Cork and other places, and and the reason why eventually that the king sought to pardon most of them because they couldn't fight them, basically. They were outnumbered from the king's ships, had only 3 ships along the West Cork coast at any given time, so they were completely outnumbered. How do we know all this? Well, we have sources, not just the map that I showed you, but also Henry Mannering, who was one of the pirates at the time, and he wrote a discourse, or a 5-chapter, very short, but a 5-chapter discourse for the king in 1616 when he was pardoned. And he sets out in those 5 chapters the whole workings of the alliance, or the confederacy, as he calls them, of pirates. And he also gives us really good insight into the operations of the pirates, not just around West Cork, but across the Atlantic in places like Newfoundland and North Africa and Northwest Africa, and why they were frequenting the places over there in the Mediterranean. And again, it gives an insight into the use of islands. So for instance, here I just picked one excerpt from Mannering's discourse. At St. Peter's, they may water at Lapidusa, and generally in all of the Greek islands, they shall have good quarter, so they'll be well accepted, and great store of hogs, so they get food there, and they are good people, especially at Milo. So you have Portofino again in the Gulf of, pardon me now, in the Gulf of Tunis, had very good watering and was a good place to careen or clean their ships, it being landlocked. So again, he can give you, this source gives a really good operational insight into how the pirates, I suppose, were able to revictual, and why it was so important to keep the locals happy as well, because they needed them to supply them with goods when they landed in these places, including fresh water. So it's a really important source from that perspective, and it's a first-hand account by one of the ex-pirates themselves. He also talks about the seasonality of the piracy, and as the likes of today would show you, the pirates didn't want to be in Irish waters in a day like today. They preferred to be in North Africa. So they would, during the winter months here, they would go to either Newfoundland or North Africa. And then when it was summer here, they would come back. And back then we probably had summers. So they would have had some good time, or good space of time and good weather along the southwest coast of Cork. So again, it's knowing the seasonality of their operations, which is important as well. These were the main harbours, but as I said at the outset, there were all these little inlets, hundreds of little inlets that they would have frequented and would have known about, because it was all about a network of knowledge as well, and the locals, excuse me, would have informed them of areas that they could come into. So if the king's ship at any given time was in one area, they would be able to go to another area. So Crookhaven, Baltimore, and Lemcon, outside Skull, were the main places of where they would settle, and where many of them settled, and then worked legitimately as either sailors or shoemakers or laborers, etc. So, and this is borne out by, again, the sources. Sir Arthur Chichester, the Lord Deputy at the time, he wrote his letters, and he gives quite an amount of information on the alliance. Sorry. And he says, though all of them, the harbours in Munster, be very commodious and safe for pirates to come unto, yet Baltimore is most frequented by them. And Baltimore at the time had been developed, or was beginning to be developed rather, as a settlement town under the plantation. So many of these Englishmen, they're predominantly Englishmen, but there was others there too. There was renegade Dutch, there was Irish. It was an Irish pirate, was in Crookhaven, and there were French renegades there. So there was a multicultural brigade of them, but it was dominated by English pirates who had been, I suppose, kicked out of southwest England or the West Country because James clamped down on the pirate harbours there, and they just transferred over to Ireland because they were familiar with the coast. So again, many of them knew a lot of the undertakers and the plantation officers that were involved in the Munster plantation here. So they weren't coming to an area or to people, government officials that they weren't already familiar with. And this is again just the main pirate bases in the Roaring Water Bay area, Baltimore, Crookhaven, and there's Lemcon there, which is just north of northwest of Long Island. But their Atlantic pirate bases ensured that they had what, again, I refer to as a triangular hunting ground. So West Cork, Mamora in Northwest Africa, which is in Morocco, and Harbour Grace, and then Ferryland in Newfoundland. And you can see that the strategic nature of these three bases, and Ireland being extremely strategic as well, because they could intercept ships coming from the north, coming from the English Channel, coming from Western Europe. And then in Mamora, they could intercept ships going into and coming out of the Straits and the Mediterranean. And then all within that pirate hunting ground, they had an open field or an opened ocean, I suppose, to intercept ships there. They didn't go south of and this is noted by Mannering, they didn't sail farther than the Azores because it was too much of an expanse of sea, and that's where the King's ships were better sailing ships because they were bigger and they could intercept the pirates more. So they tended to stay within this hunting ground area, skirt the coasts, and intercept ships that way. So it was very strategic in the way that they set out. From the three main men who were the leaders of the pirate confederacy or alliance, Bishop was the main, the admiral, and he set up his headquarters in West Cork. Easton, who was the vice admiral, set up his headquarters in Newfoundland, and it was Mannering who actually set up the headquarters down in around Mamora. So again, you had this kind of strategic leadership attached to the actual pirate alliance as well. But then what's the physical remains from an archaeological perspective? Much of it is by association. And we have to, I suppose, be careful not to try to box something so that it tells the story of the pirates. And what I mean by that is that you'd be tempted to say, oh, well, it must have been, one of the pirates must have been here. We have no definitive evidence beyond sites by association. So for instance, the sites associated with William Hull, who was one of the primary agents of the crown, who sent over as part of the plantation, who was basically the broker for the pirates. He set up his estate in Lemcon, very clever man, didn't establish a settlement under the terms of the plantation because that would have focused too much attention on himself. So he just set up his own estate. He was very well connected, and he built a fortified house there, and also took over the O'Mahony castles at Castle Point. So he was in the area from about 1602, 1603. So his timing ties in with the advent or the start of the Pirate Alliance. And he officially moved there in 1608. It was his brother Henry who settled in Clonakilty as well. So you see these connections in the port areas all along the West Cork coast, where they could control the goods coming in. They could do business with the pirates coming in as well. Thomas Crook then actually was the main person behind establishing the actual plantation settlement and town of Baltimore. And he was there from about 1605, but again, officially from 1607. And he leased the castles first off Fineen O'Driscoll. So Fineen O'Driscoll, the Gaelic lord, this was his main castle, Doonashade, and he handed it over to Thomas Crook. And again, the town of Baltimore was quickly established. It received its charter, like many others, in 1613, which meant it could send two representatives to Parliament. And therefore they had a lot of say and could have a lot of vote potential as well. But by 1608, which was only a year after he officially settled there, he was suspected of dealing with pirates, with Richard Bishop in particular. And it was the intercession of the Bishop of Cork on his behalf that got him off the hook for that. So he again was well connected. There are some lesser archaeological hints in the landscape. Again, in the absence of excavation, it's very hard to date them beyond saying, well, they possibly are from that period or earlier even. But this is where the value of local knowledge comes in. And during my time down in Lemcon, doing surveys down there, it was the local people who really told me about the names of places and the names of fields and the names of quays and things like that, that really pointed to some of this evidence in the landscape. So you're talking about quay steps, so steps leading down to what was an old quay here at the top. But the name of the place here is the Boathouse Field. So again, the whole name suggests it was being used from a maritime perspective. The basal remains of a long quay here, just down from Lemcon House. Again, a little small boat harbour possibly here. And this place is called the Long Dock, and lo and behold, you can see the remains of a very long, all this is of a long quay, or a dock, again, just immediately to the east of Lemcon House. All robbed out at this stage, unfortunately. There's even mooring stones there. But again, as I say, these things are very hard to date specifically. They could be later. But what we do know is that at the time, the area here couldn't possibly have been so inundated with muds, because we have records of ships coming in to the quays here, to William Hull in sources like the State Papers and the High Court of Admiralty papers as well. So we know at least small to medium sized vessels could come in here, and there must have been facilities there for them. Just walking in the mud flats there, I found lots of pottery, including a fragment of a 17th century Tuscan oil jar. So again, it could be late 17th century, mid 17th century. I'm not saying it's from one of the pirates' cargoes, but at least it points to 17th century maritime activity in that area. From again looking at the State Papers and the High Court of Admiralty papers, we get an idea of the kind of material that was coming in, or the kind of goods that were coming in. I'm just keeping an eye on my time. And for instance, one pirate, Captain William Bow, who was, I suppose, plying the waters between Baltimore and Kinsale, because he was very much involved with Vice Admiral Captain Henry Skipwith in Kinsale, Skipwith was based in Jamesfort, or Castlefort, which is Castle Park rather, and Jamesfort now at the time. And in fact, he used to allow William Bow to store his goods in there, for a cost, obviously. And he used to give some of his goods to Captain Skipwith and to his wife and to his daughter, who William Bow wanted to marry. But these are the kind of cargoes that were coming in. Sorry about that. Cloth, fustic cloth, cotton wool, guinea pepper, and I'll say more about pepper, cotton yarn, glasses, a barrel of glasses, 3 dozen Brazil bows, 17 compasses, an anchor and cables, Brazil beds, so some type of beds, a barrel of powder, so Brazil wood beds, I presume, and Brazil wood bows, a barrel of powder, and a barrel of aniseeds. So again, all of these are very utilitarian cargoes, but very highly tradable. And a lot of these are exotic. So the pepper, the Brazil wood bows, and beds, for instance, the local people generally wouldn't have access to those, at least at such prices, because there was a reciprocal trade between the locals and the pirates, and so it meant they could get access to goods that they normally wouldn't have access to. So it very much a symbiotic relationship between those on land and the pirates at sea, and that includes the officials of the government as well. And they were noted at the time there were both land pirates and sea sharkers. The pirates themselves were referred to as sea sharkers, but in complaining about the corruption with some of the government officials in West Cork, they were referred to as land pirates. So they were noted as dealing with the pirates. Another example, for instance, of how ingrained the piracy was within the official landscape, in 1610, Pirate Captain Thompson, he was serving on a jury on Sherkin Island. So the local admiral or vice admiral must have invited him on to serve on that duty. Pirate Roger Salter was living on Ringaroig Island, for instance, and that he is the first Salter that I can trace coming in to the locality. So that doesn't mean he is the first, but he's the first, the earliest that I think he came in around 1609 and stayed there afterwards. He settled after his pardon and settled on Ringaroiga. Several lived on Long Island, others lived on Cape Clear, and the Dutch marked most of these on the 1612 chart. So again, the islands playing a huge role in the pirate activity. Again, Roger Middleton, he was the English official tasked with arranging pardons for the pirates after about 1610, 1609, 1610. And he says that which passeth here in Munster are reals of 8, Barbary ducats and dollars, and it is thought some treasure is buried on land by those pirates. So that really harks back to the archetypal kind of pirates that we think about when we think of Hollywood's portrayal of pirates. But this was an account in 1611, so sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. So we do have a reference to treasure or monies being buried on land in West Cork, but it was by the wives of the pirates. So they would bury the monies their husbands sent home so that the officials couldn't find it. So that's the type of buried treasure that we are dealing with. It's a very pragmatic approach to the business of piracy and the social acceptance of pirates in the landscape. But I suppose, speaking of archetypal pirates, we are, I suppose, used to thinking about all things shiny when we think of pirates. And particularly, I suppose, doubloons and gold and silver and all of that. But again, this is John Debris. He died. He's an underwater archaeologist. He passed this year, unfortunately, but he probably positively identified the fiery dragon, which was one of the first pirate ships or pirate associated ships or shipwrecks identified um, so far. So it's very hard to identify a pirate ship because most were merchantmen that were captured. So they were pirate ships used by pirates rather than there being an entity as a pirate ship. This is images of what's known as the Cheapside Hoard, and it's a fantastic, I suppose, assemblage of jewels and gold and silver and just amazing stuff altogether. Gemstones that was found. This is a beautiful emerald clock, a little clock. It was found in 1612 in a place called Cheapside, and I'll just mention it again later on. But it was found in 1912 by workmen in an area of near Fleet Street. But Cheapside was the main place where the jewelers were in the 17th and 18th century. So this was all found together in under a building, so it had been hidden away. But it's but it's believed to represent pirate treasure from that time, dating from the 16th and into the early 17th century. So I suppose while we think of all things shiny, it does exist. And this is, I think the Cheapside Hoard is going on display again in the British Museum next year, which would be great. We do know there was trade, overseas trade, though, going on again, going back to thinking about what was happening in the landscape and how it was a continuation of what was happening there anyway. And just taking one example, and I have Dr. Anne Lynch to thank for this information and this image from her excavations in Sherkin Friary. Just from the excavations in Sherkin Friary, where the monks in the later medieval time were also involved in trade and trade overseas. So trades, merchants coming and sailors coming and ships coming and trading with the monks. So these are the type of pottery that was recovered by Anne in her excavations. And there are examples of pottery from Spain, Portugal, France, Holland, Germany, Italy, England, Ireland, and China. Of the Iberian assemblages alone, a rich regional typological diversity is represented, says Anne, with significant quantities of 9 different types of wares. So this just gives you an idea of the sheer international approach to trade that was coming in to areas like West Cork long before the pirates came along. So this wasn't an unknown landscape. It was a well-known landscape for trade across to the continent and beyond. So that was continued under the piracy with their goods. There was different types of goods coming in then, but trade to the continent and elsewhere was very much part and parcel of the landscape, going back into the medieval times as well. But I suppose from the early 17th century, when we have that explosion in exploration and colonization across the world, and the New World and the Americas, but also the East and the West Indies, and right down into India and places like that, and across the deserts to Asia, the spices and the spice trades is really what the maritime empires were vying to get control of. I suppose from very early on, the world had been split in two by the Pope between Spain and between the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal. But then later on in the early 17th century, with the development of all these companies, merchant guild companies, the East and West Indies companies, you have all of these maritime empires trying to take over the monopoly of the sources of spice trade, particularly. So we're talking about black pepper, cinnamon, sugarcane later on in Barbados and Jamaica. Others like vanilla, nutmeg, and cloves, things that we take for granted today. And as I say, pepper at the time was known as black gold. We will spill it on the table now and we'll blow it off. We don't think about it, but it was even though the likes of cinnamon and nutmeg and the really high quality spices like oh God, it's gone out of my head. Saffron were worth more. Pepper was traded in such quantities that it was more valuable in the end than the others because of the sheer quantities that were traded, both legitimately and illicitly as well. But they came from all over. They came from places like Calicut in the coast of Malabar in southwest India, for instance. This was a huge spice trade location. And once the Western empires found out about it, they couldn't get enough. And as you can see here, this is 1572, you see this expansion of settlement all along the coast of Malabar, just based on spices alone. Spices told their own story, and I could talk about spices all night. But I love digging down a little bit just to give an idea of where these things came from and how international this trade was and how important it was to the pirates to capture ships with this kind of material cargo in it, because it was an easy way of obtaining really high quality cargo. So pepper could have come from the Indian Ocean, the South China Seas, and places like the Malaccas, Malaysia, and Borneo. Cinnamon from Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Vanilla from Mexico, Madagascar, and Indonesia. And nutmeg would have come from Indonesia and the Spice Islands. Cloves, again from Indonesia, Malaya, Archipelago, Zanzibar, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Tanzania. Sugarcane, Jamaica and Barbados. Wine from the continent, silk from China, and then salt from places like the northern Adriatic. And of course, the salt roads marking the routeways from the deserts of Africa. And that's why the ports and harbors in North Africa and Northwest Africa was so important to the pirates. Because, of course, the sultans and the reis who were in charge there, whether it was the Ottoman Turks or the Moroccan sultanates, controlled the trade from the salt roads. So the pirates had to do business with them in order to get access to these condiments. And again, just looking at the meaning of the words, because again, we think an awful lot of our words in English are maritime origin. So the Latin word for species, or spice, comes from the Latin word for species, meaning something of special value. It even means money. Again, as I say, pepper was traded in such commodities that it used to be paid taxes, or used to pay taxes. A man's wealth could be measured by how much pepper he had in his household, for instance. And even the King of Spain at one stage couldn't afford to pay the exchequer, and he paid the taxes in pepper rather than in gold bullion. So even the rulers would have to settle debts in pepper as well if they didn't have the money. They ran out of silver after the Armada, of course. Land could be purchased in pepper, and again an association here with the peppercorn rent, which was that charge for land. Under William III, and the Trinity Church in Manhattan in New York was paid for by pepper. So again, it highlights how valuable pepper was. So salt, of course, the word salary salt is the same word, and in Latin it was salt was used as for Roman soldiers when they were paid in salt, and that's where the word salary comes from. So it's just something that's an aside, but condiments were currency as well, is basically what I'm saying. So you can see why they were so valuable to the pirates, and why they were so valuable to the locals, and why locals, and when I mention locals, I mean both Gaelic locals and also New English locals and Old English locals living along the southwest coast of Munster at the time, because they could get access to all of this. So with the growth in legitimate trade, there was also the expansion of illicit trade, as we know. And smuggling, of course, went hand in hand with piracy. You had to land the goods. They were trading on the high seas as well. One ship would trade with another, but generally cargo was brought ashore. And as I say, it was a reciprocal trade. You had time is it? All right, okay. The people on land would get paid 3 times the amount, and this is in the sources, for the goods that they could supply the pirates, and they got the goods from the pirates at a reduced amount. So there was this symbiotic relationship as part of that kind of trade between them. And the kind of goods that the locals would provide to the pirates would be hides or beeves, and these were highly valued elsewhere. Tallow for wax, dried fish, of course, beer. They might have wine that came in trade ships, and then they would trade the wine as well with the pirates. And then salt, of course, local salt as well. So these were the kind of things that they could trade with the pirates themselves. Again, this is just more images of the Cheapside hoard to give you an idea of some of the amazing stuff. But when you look at the Cheapside hoard and you read what was in some of the cargoes of some of these pirates, you can see these two things overlapping. So Captain John Jennings, for instance, when he came into West Cork, he had 150 chests of sugar, 36 cases of cinnamon, again pepper, but he had personal chests of pearls, diamonds, and silver. He had clothes quilted with Barbary gold worth between £400 and £500, and clusters of diamonds and rubies. So the Cheapside hoard is very much representative of some of the material that was coming in and some of the goods that were coming in the pirate ships. So ships then. You couldn't really be a pirate without a ship. Although there is a pirate down in West Cork in Canty's Cove, and he didn't have ships. He just lured captains ashore and he pushed them off the cliff. And then he captured their ships. So he didn't have ships of his own. But generally pirates have ships. So they would have the smaller kind of ships, which we would call flyboots or Dutch flutes, because they were able to they could carry a lot of cargo, and they were smaller and fleeter to go in and around the islands. And again, Lord High Admiral, the Earl of Nottingham, noted that the pirates in Munster were more than capable of outmaneuvering the 2 or 3 Royal Naval ships sent to patrol the Irish coastline each year. So they began to identify very quickly that they couldn't defeat these pirates' alliance. And because of that, because they had such willing locals, they could safely come into the harbours there. And these are some of the sites they would have used. This is one very rare site, a careening site. This is in Baltimore in the Cove area, where the rocks are chiselled out to allow a ship to be brought up to it. When the tide is out, it can be turned on its side and it can be cleaned. And then when the tide comes in, you can turn the ship around and do the other side. Very few of these have been identified. The Martins in Baltimore showed this to me first, so I'm very grateful to them. And you can see even the rock cut holes there for the ropes that were used. And this is Peter Murray's lovely sketch of that he sent me of a ship in the cove being careened just there. So it's lovely to have that representation. So the pirates needed to be able to utilize the landscape to actually function as well. Excuse me. Also, they needed to get on and off in remote places. And I have a huge fascination with steps, rock cut steps in particular. And again, my grateful thanks to many locals all along the coast of Cork and even wider afield in Waterford as well, who have pointed out these steps all over. Now, some of them have other uses. And again, it's like I said earlier, it's very hard to date these. They can date to many periods. And there's been very little study done on them. Excuse me. These are the ones in Hare Island called the coffin steps. So presumably they're very wide. They were used to bring on and off coffins from the island with people, no doubt. And these are another a set of steps in Kinnish Harbour that Nigel Taus showed me as well. So hewn out of the actual rock in very remote areas, and you bring your ship up or your boat up, and you'd be able to access. And these are just some other examples. One on the Salties, these in Dunmore East, Badger Cove, Credden Head down in West Waterford, excuse me, with a lovely cave associated to it. And these are in Waterford as well, Port Ely. So, excuse me. And then there are others that are, as I term them, they're more like archaeological structures. Two of them, and while the others they give access to water sources, so you could climb the steps and get, there might be a spring or a well there. Or they may follow the old roads inland, like the Credden Head one there, for instance. Others are particularly focused on, I think, clandestine activity because they've been hewn in such areas that they can only have been used for one thing. Now, again, dating to a particular period is the difficulty because you can't date the rock, but certainly these are in Crookhaven, which overhangs a cavern that goes through a sleek head there at Gokane Point. It's on a promontory, so who knows, maybe the steps go right back into the Iron Age, we don't know, or they could be later steps. Funnily enough, directly across the way, that's where the Coast Guard station was built in the 1800s, and perhaps it was built there so that smuggling was, any smugglers coming in here were stopped. This is the other one then, down in Castlehaven again. Thomas Somerville rather, told me about this one. It's on his land in Drashan. It's a fantastic site. It's more unique so far because I haven't come across another one across the world, let alone in Ireland. It's a series of rock cut steps and platforms, and then right up at the top, hewn into the rock, there's these two niches that you would put your lanterns or your candles. So directly influencing bringing boats in at night. And Captain Mannering, who wrote his discourse, as I mentioned, talks about the pirates coming in the dead of night to the land so that they could clandestinely drop their goods. So this is definitely a site associated with smuggling. The only thing I can't say about it is what year it dates to or what period it dates to. But there must be others with little lantern niches like that around, but we just haven't found them. But it's an amazing site. So the logistics, and I know I'm nearly coming to the end. The logistics of piracy, as I say, they needed ships. They needed to be favourable ones. So flyboots, which were Dutch-built ships, are very well known to have been favoured by the pirates. From our wreck inventory that the National Monuments Service has, we have a list of at least 12 pirate-associated ships being lost around the coast of Cork and Kerry. Many of them are directly associated with the Pirates of the Alliance. So in places like Skull, in Bantry, and places like that off Dursey. So there are ships out there that have been sunk from that period. We just have to try to identify them. And speaking of one that possibly is associated, and I'd like to very much thank my friend and my colleague, Juliana O'Donoghue from Mizzen Archaeology. She lives there locally as well in Clonakilty, for supplying this information and imagery for me. This is Juliana's wreck, really, generically called the Coconut Wreck, because she found the wreck during archaeological monitoring of the outfall pipe there for the Skull sewage plant and main drainage in 2012, I think. And it's an amazing wreck. Definitely dates to the first quarter of the 17th century from the cargo that has come off it and the material archaeological objects that have come off it, including coconuts. So hence its generic name, the Coconut Wreck. It's in near the townland of Culla, so it's also sometimes referred to as the Culla Wreck, but it's more generally known as the Coconut Wreck. These are just some of Juliana's imagery. Quernstone has come off the wreck, and it's really well intact from the lower deck downwards. You can even look into the hole there in this image and see chests under. Now it's well buried in about 12 fathoms of water, 12 feet of water. Sorry, 12 meters of water. But it's an amazing wreck, and the coconuts even have stamps on them that could be either plantation owner stamps or merchant stamps. So Juliana is hoping to be able to trace those at some. Hopefully, we can find where they came from. Again, these are just a view of the coconuts, and again, thanks to Juliana for supplying those. There are only a handful of wrecks around the world that have coconuts on them, so this is a very important wreck, even just from that alone. And you can even do DNA evidence seemingly on coconuts, so there's much to be done. But you can see here, one was actually topped and emptied and used as a bowl on board, so utilizing the shell itself by one of the sailors. So again, I suppose as archaeologists, we have to remember that we're talking about humans here, and it's the human material remains that we're dealing with. So I think shipwrecks are very, very evocative of that. And when you see something like this with a potential merchant mark or a plantation mark on it put on by somebody, and then one of them used as a bowl, then it really brings the human story into it as well. So yeah, these are just the historical sources, not just Mannering, but High Court of Admiralty papers, state papers, proclamations, travel logs, sailing logs, manuscript collections, and contemporary discourses are all sources for these piracy. And we're lucky in this period to have those sources for maritime and trade and piracy as well. So for anyone wishing to do further research on it, these are the main sources that I have come across. And just to give an idea of the cargo, some of these sources list the cargoes, and the ship that Juliana has discovered, there's a potential that it could be associated with a pirate, Klaus Campaign. We can't say definitively, but he lost a ship in 1625, right in the area where the wreck was found, in and about Long Island area in Lemcon. And certainly we have a full account of his ships coming in at the time, what cargo they carried, what they offloaded. So you can begin to match up some of the cargo with some of the material on the wreck and hopefully find a match, and dating evidence as well. So who knows, it may turn out to be Campaign's prize, but we don't know yet. As the piracy changed, as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, the Ottoman corsairs, or the Barbary corsairs, the Ottoman Turks, began to take over. And this is, I'm saying this because there were two Englishmen and two brothers, the Pirates Nut, which is a strange name, John and Robert Nutt, and they sailed under the flag of the Ottoman Turks in 1631 during the time of the raid on Baltimore. So they were scouting the coast from Wexford all the way around to in West Cork, and they are noted as having lost one of their ships in Dunworley Bay, which isn't too far away from me there, just around the corner in the wider Clonakilty Bay. So and they weren't just hunting for cargo or other ships, they were also hunting for slaves, white slaves in this case. So they used to capture the local populace. And the Dunworley Bay wreck, this is, I think, my final slide, or second last slide. It could be one of theirs as well. It's certainly, from the cannons that are on it and the material that's on it, it dates to the period in question. We have a name for one of the ships that they lost, the Rover, or the Black Mary, which was Robert Nutt's ships, again wrecked in that bay, in the General Bay there in 1631, part of the Algerine fleet that raided Baltimore. So again, not only might it be part of that pirate fleet, but associated with that fairly infamous raid on Baltimore as well. And he used to sail with Richard Bishop in the 1610s, Robert Nutt, but then when Richard Bishop was pardoned and settled in West Cork, Nutt went on and joined the Corsairs on the coast of Barbary in North Africa, and they began coming into the waters around North Atlantic then as well. So the material from the Dunworley Bay wreck again points to it being in the early part or the first quarter of the 17th century. The guns from there, the maker's marks on the guns are the John Brown, dating to the early part of that century. They're quite ugly looking guns, which again, some of the iron guns from that period were, and the little swivel gun, now it's broken there, the muzzle of it, but it would have looked like the one up here, which is dates to about 1607. Again, so the armaments from the ship dated to the first quarter of the 17th century. And again, even this elephant tusk that was washed up on the bay might be associated with that wreck, or could be associated with the Amity as well, which is another later slave trader that went down in the bay. But from the excavations that we undertook on the Dunworley Bay wreck, a colleague of mine in America, who's a shipwreck expert or ship construction expert, said that it looked something like a Dutch built ship. So again, potentially it could be associated with being a ship type that would be favored by the pirates. So again, we have to be cautious not to try to box these things to suit our narrative, but I suppose there is a potential that it could be this wreck associated with Robert Nutt as well. So, final slide, what happened to the pirates? Well, basically they were suppressed, and they submitted to pardons, but there was also 3 or 4 major events. Legal measures, the law that didn't extend from England to here, that could allow pirates to be captured, was enacted so that it covered Ireland in 1613 and came into force in 1614. So for the first time, pirates could be captured in Ireland before they'd have to be sent to England to be tried. Mamora, their main base in Spain in 1614, was lost to the Spanish, so they lost their main connection there. Direct actions, they began executing pirates then. 26 pirates were hanged on the shore in Youghal, for instance, some of them associated with the Alliance. 1614 attack by the Dutch in Crookhaven was a huge blow to the pirates, because it meant that others could come in and attack them firsthand. And then through mediation and negotiation, the majority of the pirate captains took pardons. So you suddenly saw a huge fall in the amount of pirates active around the coast at that time, and many of them actually settled. The likes of Peter Easton didn't. He went on to the Duchy of Savoy, now in France, and he settled there and became a marquis. And others were able to return to privateering under Charles after 1625, when Charles I became king after James died, because he again legitimately allowed privateers to operate. So some of them went back to their old legitimate maritime activity. But most of the Alliance disappears from our records, and we lose track of them. So as Henry Mannering himself in the closing chapter of his discourse, he says they merely ceased to exist. The kind of entity that was the Alliance, or the Confederacy as he called them, merely ceased to exist because they just began to dissipate and disappear. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a very fascinating talk, and I'm sure there's an awful lot there that's new to most of us. But any questions? Time for a couple of questions, maybe. Anyone with a question, or has? Yes.
During the talk, it was very much mentioned the archipelago and the use of islands for the pirates
Mhm.
to elude capture, etc., from the British. And I know it's a bit earlier, but I can see the connection to Grace O'Malley and the pirates in Clew Bay. Was there any connection between them?
There was no real connection between them as such, in the sense that she died at the same year as Queen Elizabeth in 1603. So there would have been more of a connection between her and the Gaelic lordships, the O'Driscolls, in the sense of being maritime lords. She was a maritime lord, commanded a maritime lordship. So did the O'Driscolls, the O'Sullivan Bears, and the like. So there wouldn't have been any connection with her and the alliance after 1603. But the use of islands is a known, you know, I suppose, landscape of clandestine activity across the world. As I say, it's known about in the Pirates of the Caribbean and all across in China and the South China Seas. So it was a favored kind of landscape feature that allowed pirates to operate. So she would have been the same. She would have found security within her islandscape in Clew Bay, where she could have retreated if she was being chased. And the larger ships under Elizabeth wouldn't have been able to get in there. So, so yeah, so they afforded a command center, I suppose, where you controlled that kind of landscape, because it was your landscape, you were familiar with it. So, but there was no crossover that I can find anyway between the two, because she had died in 1603.
Have a question? Well, once again, oh, oh, sorry, yes.
I was wondering, Connie, do you know what happened to William Hull? I know Elizabeth Freak wrote in her diaries of, I think it was William Hull, who had leased Rathbarry Castle from her husband sometime in the 1650s, I think, or later. And she obviously had a crow to pluck with him, because they came back from England and he wouldn't let them in, and she had to go elsewhere.
Right.
Some stage then she wrote again that he was now buried in the part of the graveyard that was for the common Irish.
Yeah, I he, after the there's a lot about him in the depositions, where when his place was attacked in my camera's gone funny, when he was attacked in 1641, and he basically had to run out of his lands. He did come back after that, I believe, but and I think, yeah, he's supposed to be buried there in Skull Graveyard, but I think he had such connections that he just continued, but not to such a degree, or to such a wealthy degree that he was able to operate beforehand. But he was so well connected, that, like, he was an old man then, but he was married into the Boyles and the first Earls of Cork's family, so he was very well protected, I suppose, in one way. So yeah, I haven't followed up what happened with him. But he was targeted a lot because he was serving two masters, I suppose. He was cute in that respect. But I know his brother was very successful down in Clonakilty as well.
Judging by the Disney movies, pirates were a pretty bloodthirsty lot. Is there anything known about how they treated the crew and the passengers of the ships that they captured?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned that there might have been an unwritten code, or if there was a written one, we don't know about it. But because many of the pirates, and most of them were English, but most of them had been legitimate mariners, they decided to adopt the same approach as if they were legitimate privateers, and only attack the ships of the enemy of the crown. So they would attack Spanish, Dutch, and French ships, kind of, rather than their own English ships. And that, in a way, that led to many of them being pardoned because they were looked favorably on. But there was one pirate, and they would treat the people on those ships accordingly. They wouldn't treat them too badly, but Peter Easton, he's the Vice Admiral who ended up in the Duchy of Savoy, he was known to be not to follow the code. And not only would he put others to death, but he put many of his own to death as well. And on one occasion, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Pirates of Lundy Island off Wales, but the main captain there, Salkeld was his name, he served under Easton and he set up his kind of little empire. He called himself the King of Lundy on Lundy Island during this period. And he seems to have been a very cheeky man. He was very successful on Lundy, but when he was sailing eventually with Easton, he did something, he fell out with Easton anyway, and Easton, about 30 miles from Newfoundland, chucked him overboard. So yeah, they could be brutal, but it depended on the pirates. But the alliance, the kind of piracy that I'm interested in, seemed to have followed a kind of a code that kind of ingratiated themselves and didn't. They caused mayhem with trade rather than mayhem with people, I suppose, in many ways. So yeah, they weren't your bloodthirsty kind of pirate bands, but there was occasions when there was. There's another account of one of the pirate captains taking women captured and treating them badly. But so they're kind of once-off accounts, but it wasn't the overall approach by the men of the Alliance.
Okay, on that note, again, thank you very much indeed, Connie, and we'll leave you to the rest of your evening in Ballyferriter and
Well, thank you.
improve down there. So thank you again very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for coming along on a bad night. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
So goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.